what they say in verse 3. He says, you have nothing in common with us. That's very significant. If we don't have a commonality of goals and purposes, then we have nothing. It doesn't matter if we think we have the same ideas or if we think we're going in the same direction. If we don't have fundamental commonality of purpose, of goals, of beliefs, then we really have nothing in common. Any commonality we may strive for above that is merely superficial. And it's not going to hold up in the end. You have nothing in common with us. We're going to do this ourselves. We're going to do this. This is the way. We know it needs to be done. They're not being selfish. They're not trying to exclude people unnecessarily. But they are saying, if you're not with us in this purpose, then you're just not going to be with us. And that's the way it goes. Interestingly enough, I think if you were a Jewish person reading this, some things would be brought to your mind from Mosaic law. In fact, some places where the early Jews, I think, where they maybe made some mistakes. There are several places in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, where it says that they are not to make a covenant or a treaty with the surrounding nations. You might want to jot down Exodus 23:32, Exodus 34:12, and Deuteronomy 7:2 for starters. These are some places where they were told, don't be making pacts, don't be making treaties with the people of the lands that you go in to conquer. You need to wipe them out. And that sounds harsh, that makes us uncomfortable, but that's the way it was. God wanted those people wiped out. He wanted a new holy nation on the promised land to be taking place, and they were supposed to eradicate those people, not make treaties with them, not kind of make an arrangement on the side. And when God's people failed to do that and did make treaties and agreements, that's where they start getting themselves into trouble. So someone who, we look and see what they're doing, they're following that principle. We're not going to make arrangements with people, treaties, covenants, agreements with people who are not on board with what we are doing. There is backlash to this. In fact, we mentioned this on your handout, the point number 3 on the second on the back side. There is backlash for sticking with their principles. We see this in verse 4. The people of the land discouraged the people. This is a very strong word, rafah. There was physical fear, balah. And apparently in verse 5 there are legal ramifications. They hired counselors against the Jews to frustrate their counsel during this time. Something else I kind of want you to notice is that these legal consultants, they start from the beginning of this time period and they continue to do this, as the text says in verse 5, they continue to do this until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So that's about from 536 BC to at least 521. This is not just a little isolated pocket of resistance. This is a 15-year ongoing, persistent opposition to what the Jews are trying to do by rebuilding the temple. And that tends to be the way opposition is. It doesn't remit. It doesn't say, okay, well, I've lost this one, I'm going to move on. It is pounding, it is persistent, and it is consistent, as it was with these people. Now, in light of that, the author is going to, before he says what the Jews did in light of this opposition, before he gives you the outcome for this particular episode, he's going to show 3 more episodes. Okay, if you recall, the first episode is there in verse 6. And I'm going to see if I can get back. Okay, here we go. So example number 1 in chapter 4, verse 6. General opposition in the reign of Ahasuerus. Now, in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. Okay. So this is several years later. By this point, the temple has been built. But that's not Ezra's concern. Ezra's concern is simply to show a history of persistent opposition. Before we move on to the next verse, I want you to see something. It's just a little clue. I don't want to blow this out of proportion, but I just want you to see something. The word accusation, there in chapter 4, verse 6, that they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. The word accusation is the word sitna. Sitna. That comes from the Hebrew word Satan, from which we get the name Satan. And I don't want to blow that out of proportion and say, well, you know, what they were doing was satanically driven. But when you look at the broader theology of opposition, and when you look and say, I don't see any other reason for what they are doing, politically, economically, socially, you wonder if it isn't, the text isn't trying to say something. That these accusations are being driven from the accuser himself. Now, Zechariah, am I getting ahead of myself here? Maybe. I am getting ahead of myself. Zechariah, I believe it's chapter 3. We'll look at this later, chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. He basically places the opposition that Zerubbabel and the high priest Joshua are going through at this time. He basically lays it at the feet of Satan and says, Satan is accusing our leadership. And our leadership needs to make sure that in spite of those accusations, they are still going through with what they are supposed to be doing, namely rebuilding the temple and reestablishing the worship system of the Jews around the temple system. Satan, Satan. Verse 7 is another example of opposition. This is now yet another 20 years later or so, in the days of Artaxerxes, Bishlam, Mithridates, Tabeel, and the rest of the colleagues, his colleagues wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia. The text of the letter was written in Aramaic and translated from Aramaic. Now, I thought that verse 7 was the beginning of this whole series of the rest of the chapter, but one commentator says that no, they think that's one episode, and then verse 8 starts yet another episode, because in verse 8 you have a whole different cast of characters. So very likely, verse 7 discusses the second example, and verse 8 starts a whole new example. A whole different set of opposition at around the same time that these people were going through. Verse 8. Can I go back for just a minute? May I do that? Yeah. Verse 6. I want you to notice something else. And this kind of goes with the broader theme that we're going to get to in a little bit. Accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. I got to thinking about that. Satan wants Jerusalem. And I got to thinking about some verses in Revelation. So kind of, there's a little chain here going. Write down Revelation 11:2, where the prophet, it might be an angelic messenger, says, leave out the court which is outside of the temple. They're measuring the city. They're taking essentially a spiritual inventory of the city of Jerusalem during the tribulation. I think that's how we would interpret that. And he says, leave out the court which is outside the temple. Do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations. Ethnos is the word there, the nations. And they will tread it underfoot. They will tread underfoot the holy city of Jerusalem for 42 months. Okay, so who's going to be in control of the holy city for 42 months? The ethnos, the nations. 2 chapters later, Revelation 13:7, it is said of the first beast, the Antichrist, it was also given to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and authority over every tribe and every people and every tongue and every ethnos, nation, was given to him. Who's controlling, who's trampling the holy city during this time? The nations. Who's controlling the nations? The beast, the Antichrist. Who's controlling the Antichrist? He is a satanically driven individual. Satan wants Jerusalem. I don't know if I understand all the theology there, but it certainly seems to speak very relevantly to some things Jay was saying on Wednesday nights as he's talking about Old Testament eschatology and certainly events that we see unfolding in our own day. Okay, I just wanted to throw that in. I thought that was fascinating. Why this opposition? I don't think you can explain this in purely naturalistic, socioeconomic terms. We're in verse 8. we're going on to this broader example in verse 8. Example number 3 takes up most of the rest of this chapter. And I'm going to interpret this as verse 8 is a whole different set of example, a different set of complaints than what was stated in verse 7. It's a whole new ballgame here, a whole different set of people. So it takes up most of the rest of the chapter and describes another coalition against Jerusalem under Artaxerxes, led by Rehum and Shimshai. Verse 8, Rehum the commander and Shimshai the scribe wrote a letter against Jerusalem to King Artaxerxes as follows, and then he kind of reintroduces all these people. Rehum the commander in verse 9, Shimshai the scribe, the rest of their colleagues, the judges, the lesser governors, the officials, the secretaries, the men of Erech, the Babylonians, the men of Susa. Okay, this is a planned intimidation. He's bringing up all these names, all these people to intimidate the Jews and to also put some pressure on Artaxerxes. And saying, listen, there's a lot of people over here that's upset. You better do something about these Jewish people who are trying to build this, who are trying to rebuild their city. The secretaries, the men of Erech, the Babylonians, the men of Susa, the Elamites, and then in verse 10, and the rest of the nations which the great honorable Asnapar deported and settled in the city of Samaria, and the rest of the region beyond the river. Now, this very copy of the letter which they sent to him, to King Artaxerxes, your servants, the men in the region beyond the river. And then the words "and now" meaning just, okay, here's the deal. Here's what we're going to say. So, there's a huge now coalition. Okay, we've had one example in verse 6, we've had one example in verse 7, but this is verse 8 and 9 and 10. This is a huge coalition of people that are presenting some opposition to God's people. And I think the letter in verses 11 through 16 describe the dynamics of opposition. So let me see if I can find that. Do this. Dynamics of opposition. Look at verse 12. And we're just going to go through this verse by verse because I think I want you to see, I think Ezra is trying to make a point. This is how opposition works. Whether it's right or not, people who are creating an opposition, they don't care about right. They care about getting their way and putting God's people under their thumb. Verse 12, let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up from you have come to us at Jerusalem. They are rebuilding. Interesting, come to us at Jerusalem, like Jerusalem's ours, to give to them. Come to us at Jerusalem. They are rebuilding the rebellious and evil city, and are finishing the walls and repairing the foundations. Now, recall in our time frame, this is way after the temple has been built, but they're starting to rebuild the rest of the city. The walls are still down. The walls are still down in Nehemiah's time. That's why he goes back to rebuild the walls. There's still rebuilding that needs to be done. And in verse 12, these people are opposing that, and they're saying, they're pointing to the past. This has been a rebellious and wicked city. The accusers bring things up and malign them from the past. They are pointing to things that had happened hundreds of years previously and making as though those things are going to happen right now. And we'll just continue on here. Verse 13. It's interesting the speculation that they come up with. Now let it be known to the king that if the city is rebuilt and the walls are finished, that they will not pay tribute, custom, or toll, and it will damage the revenue of the kings. Okay. Now, was this certain to happen? Not necessarily. He's just saying, if they rebuild the walls, that they're not going to pay tribute to you. Well, that's not necessarily true at all. They're speculating negatively. They're dredging up false premises. And there's an exaggerated claim here also that the revenue that does not come in will damage the treasury. I don't think these people not sending their revenues is going to make a huge impact on the Persian Empire's treasury. But the opposition is trying to blow this out of proportion. They're trying to speculate this negativity. Say, if you don't do something about this, all these terrible things are going to happen. None of which make any sense. None of which are probably true. But that's what opposition does. Verse 14, now because we are in service to the palace, and it is not fitting for us to see the king's dishonor, therefore we have sent and informed the king. I didn't get too theological with this one. I just how it is.